for Formation and Liturgy here. I want to first apologize for the fact that we had some technical difficulties earlier. We had hoped to bring you this forum during our normal 10 a.m. time, but we are adjusting to the new realities, part of what we're going to talk about today, just as all of you are, and I appreciate your patience. We're happy to greet those of you who are joining us right now, but we know that many of you are going to watch a recording of this later. And we're sorry that we aren't able to take your questions live, but we are certainly available to be resources to you after you watch this presentation. I also want to thank our communications staff here at St. Bart's. Kara Flannery has been working very hard to make sure this happens. And Greg Harper has, one of our stalwart parishioners, has been working behind the scenes to make sure this happens as well too. So thank you to them for their heroic, valiant efforts today. So we're really, really grateful on very short notice that Dr. Mary Reagan has agreed to be with us for this forum. She is the executive director of the Psychotherapy and Spirituality Institute, which many of you may know has had an association with St. Bart's for a number of years. There's an office not too far from mine here that is an outpost of PSI. Mary is based at the Trinity Wall Street site of PSI. She has a PhD and is a licensed clinical social worker. She has worked in cross-cultural consulting with folks working abroad. She's worked with ER departments, OR departments. She's taught at Columbia, Fordham, and several other educational institutions. She is an expert on traumatic grief and has worked in post 9/11 settings. She's worked in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, in Louisiana after Hurricane Rita, and she has also directed a theater initiative called In Our Own Voice, Women Veterans Tell Their Stories. Dr. Reagan, we're really grateful that you have agreed to be with us to share your thoughts on how exactly we navigate this time that we are finding ourselves in. How do we deal with anxiety and isolation? Thank you so much for joining us. I know this is a topic that's on everyone's minds.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you to the St. Bart's community for inviting me in. I really appreciate the opportunity to do this. And we're in such an unprecedented time of anxiety and isolation that the notion that someone has the answers is less likely than the possibility that we all come together as a community and we try to figure it out together. So that would be my first point, is that we'll figure it out together. I'd like to begin by saying something about the spiritual aspect of what we're going through right now. We're being directed by government and medical professionals to stay at home, wash our hands, keep a distance from one another, and take solitary walks. And it's this very experience of isolation in the service of the common good that seems so paradoxical. We are to help one another by staying away from one another. And it's precisely in this context that I'm reminded of the importance of community and family and being together, the very thing that we can't really do right now. So spirituality gets defined in many different ways. And I suggest that the spiritual journey that we're on right now is about recognizing that we are one human family. We impact one another. We're not separate, though at this time we have to be physically apart. And the climate scientists have been telling us that for years. So part of our challenge, I think, is to find new ways to connect and to care for one another, those we know and love and those we don't. And I think that spirituality is about recognizing that the most vulnerable among us are going to be the most harmed. So here's what I find within myself, what I'm thinking about. How do I manage my own self-interest and self-care while not abandoning those most in need? Spirituality means finding meaning in this strange time and figuring out how to cope and how to love one another in the process. So I think that we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to learn and to deepen our spiritual lives and to grow. And having said all of that, we are nonetheless dealing with an experience of anxiety and isolation that we are only on the front curve of. We are, having this conversation on the very day, just a few hours before New York City will be shut down with empty streets and people basically in their homes or taking solitary walks. So the experience of isolation and the experience of anxiety is real. I feel it. I presume that many of you do. And one reason that the anxiety is so intense is because anxiety, by its very nature, is fueled by uncertainty. That's what it means. We like to have control. And this situation, not so much. So, unlike other disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, terrorist attacks, this one has no identifiable beginning, middle, or end. And I think that's one of the very, very difficult parts of it. We don't know how bad it will get. We don't know when it will end or how we will be personally affected and how our families will be affected. So we can expect to feel a whole range of feelings and to be psychologically challenged. I'm also thinking that in a different time, there are behaviors that would have been labeled as pathology, which today are simply labeled as good self-care. So the notion of obsessive compulsive disorder takes on a whole new meaning when we are washing our hands repeatedly and being careful about doorknobs and all other various kinds of things. Not so much pathology anymore, but just recognizing that we're being challenged deeply. So what I would like to do is I'd like to review with you some of the basic ways in which anxiety shows itself. And there are 4 different ways that I want to do that. One is by recognizing the physical effects of anxiety and what that looks like. Behavioral, emotional, and cognitive. So let's move on to that and take a look at what that might look like. First of all, I'd like to begin with physical effects of stress. And the reason that it's so important to begin with the physical is, as trauma experts have often told us, the body doesn't lie. When we're under stress, the first place it will show is in the body. And so it's really important that we pay attention to all of those various ways in which our body is sending a message about what's going on. So we have all kinds of physical ailments. We have stomach aches, diarrhea, nausea, headaches, pains, sweating or chills or thirst or tremors. We all know that rapid heart rate and shallow breathing are signs of anxiety and panic and grinding teeth. So it's important to pay attention about what your body is telling you and that you may need to give special attention to those physical symptoms. There are behaviors which often show up when we're feeling a lot of stress. Now, this first one is kind of interesting. An increase and a decrease in energy and activity levels. Well, okay, but we're in a moment right now when our activity levels have been so drastically reduced that that's hardly a symptom, but a decrease in energy is a symptom. And ironically, an increase in energy is too. because that increase in energy, depending on where it goes to, can signal a kind of manic feeling, at least some manic feelings, and should be paid attention to. I want to speak in particular about the increased use of alcohol, tobacco, drugs, whether prescribed or not. When people are under extreme stress, which we are right now, trauma specialists tell us that there are two things that are really important in trauma. One, talk about it, and two, avoid numbing yourself with drugs and alcohol. And so I just want to underline that one, because it's one of the easy ways of trying to change the channel, and in particular to block out feelings. Sleep disorder, too much or too little, early awakening, interrupted sleep. Sleep is the foundation of solid physical and mental health. And so it's really important to the extent that we can, try to regularize our sleep. Crying infrequently or an intensified startle reflex. Crying frequently, I think what we know right now and what we will know going forward is that there is a lot of reason to cry. And so there's nothing wrong with crying, and it's a way to release some of the stress that's built up. As with anything, it has to do with how frequently and how intense that is. Wanting to be alone most of the time when that is not your usual way, or blaming others for everything. Those are some of the ways that our behavior can show signs of stress. Emotionally, take a look at this first one. Fear of loss of control and being overwhelmed. Okay, so here we are in the middle of COVID-19, and we really don't have control. We have control over what we can do, but in the big picture, we are trying as best we can not to be overwhelmed. And so we want to pay attention to when those feelings start to become more intense. Obviously, anxiety, depression, guilt, and grief. We can expect sometimes more intense anger or irritability. This is going to be an issue, particularly at home with couples, partners, spouses, children. Lots of you out there are at home with one or more children that you are trying to homeschool, do your job, keep the house, get some groceries, and manage everything in the midst of an absolutely uncertain time, which is coupled with fears about how your finances are going to go and whether or not you're going to get sick, or whether you are sick already. So to the extent that we can put some distance between the feeling of anger and the response would help, rather than impulsively acting out the feelings that you, by the way, have every right to have. Feeling heroic, euphoric, or invulnerable are often precede what might be called a manic episode, which is, this sense of invulnerability, which in this context is inappropriate. It doesn't actually fit the situation. What it is a defensive reaction to the amount of fear and anxiety that we feel. Another defensive reaction is not caring about anything. You will sometimes, have people who simply adopt a veneer of, I don't care. I would also want to say about that, or any other defensive reaction that we use in a time like this, is to be as compassionate with one another as we can. All of us are doing the best we can, and we're going to have very different responses to anxiety and isolation. So This is really just a plea for compassion and to say, let's try first of all to be kind, and that will help. Obviously, feeling overwhelmed by sadness, we're going to see a lot of sadness. We're going to feel a lot of sadness. It's not pathology, it's health. It's health to recognize that you feel that kind of strain and sadness and deep feelings. As I said before, we need to be here for one another with those feelings. And finally, in terms of 4 different ways that stress shows, it also shows cognitively. Stress has a big effect on our thinking. And so if you find that you're having trouble remembering things or feeling confused, not knowing how to run a Zoom platform, having trouble thinking clearly and having trouble concentrating, these are normal. This is not anything strange. It's absolutely normal. Having trouble making decisions, decreased awareness of surroundings, not being able to solve problems in the way that you could have solved them before. So this is what it does. You know, when you think about it, body, mind, and spirit, it's all one. And so we just need to appreciate the fact that our cognition will be affected, and we are going to hopefully have enough self-compassion for ourselves as well as extend it to others. I want to say something about some tips for dealing with isolation. And before I do this, I have to confess that I had my own list of tips for dealing with isolation, which I abandoned last night before we decided on this forum, because I read an op-ed piece in the New York Times by Scott Kelly, who is the NASA astronaut who spent almost a year at the International Space Station. He was in a space capsule for almost a year. And so I thought to myself, gosh, Scott Kelly knows a lot more about this than I do. And the op-ed piece was so spectacular that I'm shamelessly lifting it. What he says is, first of all, at NASA, they had to follow a schedule rigorously. It was very important that they stayed with their schedule. And, you know, get up in the morning, don't stay up late at night, keep the same schedule. For us working at home, it can also mean not only get up at the same time in the morning, get up, shower, get dressed, act like you're going to work. Make this as normal as you can in your own home. He also talks about pacing yourself. If you're living and working in the same place, one of the things that can happen is that work can take over. For people who are living alone, this is a particular vulnerability that work can bleed into every hour of the day. And it's going to be very important not to do that. So when it's time to end work, end work. For those of you who are taking care of children at home and homeschooling and doing every other thing, you're working all the time anyway. And this sort of just simply increases the fact. Nonetheless, it's really important to take time for fun and games and music and art. Go outside. It's really important. Spending time in nature is healing. That's evidence-based research. And exercise is essential for mental and physical health. We need to do it. And wherever you are, in whatever setting, even under these rigorous conditions that we're in New York City right now, we can still go out, we can still walk, distancing ourselves from one another. And I think it's going to be one of the most important things. Scott Kelly says, get a hobby, learn something new, learn an instrument, research something you wanted to research, learn about art or music or literature. And he also suggests keeping a journal, which I thought was a very interesting idea. Describe what you're experiencing on a daily basis. Write about it. Use your 5 senses. Pay attention. Become more attentive. That could be a very interesting practice during this time. Take time to connect with family and friends through video and phone to reduce that isolation. I also want to mention here, continue or begin a spiritual practice that is important to you, whether that's daily meditation, whether that is centering prayer, whether that is deep breathing, whether that's yoga. Do something in that regard which will lower your metabolic rate, which will create some sense of homeostasis, and which will help you to make meaning of what we're all going through. Finally, Scott Kelly says, listen to the experts. Seek knowledge from accurate sources. You know, we're living in a time where truth is under assault, and people don't know what to believe. And because of that, there is enormous confusion and pain. Our world has been polarized for years now, with increasing destructive consequences. And so pay attention to where you get your information from. And I would also add to that, be vigilant about your use of social media. In this time, social media obviously has been enormously helpful. It connects people, it lets us talk to each other, it does all kinds of positive things. And it can be full of disinformation, misinformation, and the sheer volume ought to be monitored. So speaking about truth-telling, I wanted just to share this from the CDC, and it's really the first 3 that I'm most interested in. These are some facts about COVID-19. Notice the first fact that the CDC names: diseases can make anyone sick, regardless of race or ethnicity. So fear and anxiety about COVID-19 can cause people to avoid or reject others, even though they are not at risk for spreading the virus. So there is an uptick in discriminatory behavior, thoughts, and feelings towards people thought to be responsible for COVID-19. And I think it's pretty interesting that the CDC puts that as fact 1. Number 2, for most people, the immediate risk of becoming seriously ill from the virus is thought to be low. I think that's worth noting. We do know that people who are older, have pre-existing conditions, who are vulnerable, are at higher risk. We know that. But I don't want to lose sight of that fact that the CDC is sharing with us. Fact number 3, someone who has completed quarantine or been released from isolation does not pose a risk of infection to other people. And so that's important to know. That doesn't mean, of course, if I've been in self-isolation because I was near someone, maybe I self-isolated out of an abundance of caution. That doesn't mean that, down the road I might not get COVID-19. But the point is that someone who has completed it right then is not a risk factor. The 4th and 5th facts I'm not going to say much about, because basically it says wash your hands and here are the signs of COVID. And so we know that. Finally, some resources. I want to recommend the New York City Department of Health website, Thrive NYC. It's really good, and it's an excellent website to help recognize the early signs of mental health problems and substance misuse. Another website is New York City NYC Well. Really good practical information about stress, depression, anxiety, drug and alcohol use. There is free confidential mental health services available in more than 200 languages. Welcome to New York. And I also listed the organization I'm a part of, the Psychotherapy and Spirituality Institute. We are about 12 multidisciplinary therapists working, previously working together. Now we're working remotely, providing therapy remotely through video and phone consultation. So with that, I will end my part of the presentation and go back to Peter and see what we have.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Reagan. And I want to apologize to those folks that will be watching this after the fact. What we would have loved to do at this point is to ask for your own questions. We saw that about 80 of you were waiting for the forum earlier this morning, but our technical difficulties got in the way of us getting to you then. We were sad not to be able to see you then. We hope this will get to you after the fact. Though, if there are folks watching right now, I know we have some small audiences on YouTube and on Facebook. Do feel free to pose a question in the chat, and I'll incorporate it into our discussion. I'm monitoring along and would love to ask your question of Dr. Reagan. But while we're waiting for some questions to come in, I know, looking at your bio, Dr. Reagan, that you've worked in traumatic situations in the past, in 9/11, hurricanes. Obviously, this is a different kind of traumatic situation for folks, but what lessons did you learn in those contexts? What strategies were helpful in those contexts that might be helpful to folks now?
Well, the first thing, Peter, that I'd say is for us to appreciate the magnitude of the situation that we're in right now. In other words, in some senses, it feels like COVID-19 is 9/11 wrapped up in the 2008 financial crisis, wrapped up in even greater stress. So it's a massive impact. What we know is that in trauma, people experience a host of symptoms. Some of them are called intrusive symptoms, and that means you might have nightmares. For people who've had previous trauma, some other time in their life, either in childhood or in one of these experiences I've already mentioned, there can be a greater vulnerability to stress, anxiety, and depression because of the previous trauma. But it also means, by the way, that if you've had previous trauma, you got through it. And so I would say one of the things we want to do is say to people, how'd you get through it? What did you do? What helped? But in terms of symptoms, there's nightmares, there's intensified startle reaction. There also are symptoms related to numbing. And that may mean that someone feels somewhat dissociated from the experience at hand. That it feels like it doesn't come in on them. They're numb. I would respect that. I would say, okay, we're able to take in as much as we can at any given time. And so that numbing is an adaptive defensive response for what I'm going through at the moment. In terms of dealing with trauma, it helps for people to talk when they're ready. Nobody should be forced to talk because they might not be ready. And the other thing that way down the road that people typically need to do to really fully recover from trauma is to make some meaning of it. And one of the ways, even in early stages of trauma, not just in recovery, but even early stages, one of the ways people make meaning is by being available to others. In other words, people across our country and across our globe are suffering right now. And while we're all in the midst of it, maybe there's something I can do for somebody else. Maybe there's a phone call to make. Maybe you can check in on a neighbor. Maybe you can make sure that your friend and family group is doing well, and then enlarge your circle so that it goes to other people as well. We are helped by helping others. It's how it works. And so I would really want to underline that and support it. And as I said before, the other crucial issue about trauma is not to self-medicate, because the self-medication becomes a spiral down that it can be hard to pull out of.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the doing something for others piece, because we did have one question from someone who wondered about altruism and how can altruism have beneficial effects on our mental health in a time like this, and especially at this time when we are separated, as you mentioned before. What are ways in which we can reach out to others?
One thing that we know is that the online groups have proliferated and exploded in numbers, so that one of my clients was just telling me recently that there is an online support group for people in recovery from alcohol, and it happens every day. You sign up for free. The woman's name is Laura McCowan, and she runs a 1-hour support group. And the last group that my client was in, it was a Zoom meeting, and there were 400 people.
Wow!
So that's just one example of the ways in which people are doing cooking lessons online. The Metropolitan Opera is streaming every day a different opera. And so, if you're at home and you have time, you can actually listen to an opera, a different opera every day. The museums are doing work, offering, guided tours online. And so I think that our way of being altruistic will be limited only by our lack of imagination. I think we're going to become very creative.
It seems like we already have become somewhat creative.
Yes.
So we do have a few questions coming in. One person asks if you have any recommendations for simple exercises or meditations we can practice at home to manage anxiety or stress.
Oh, yes. The New York Times just had a terrific article, which I can't quote in this moment, but they give a whole list of very simple exercises to keep body and mind going. So what I remember of it is they recommend getting a jump rope, order weights, and be sure you do weight training. Go online for yoga classes that you can find so that you do yoga and stretching. And when leaving in New York, I say your building, use the stairs instead of the elevator to get the cardio up and down. So, Peter, I wish I had the exact notation of that article, but
we can find it and put it in the comments after the.
I'll send it to you.
Great.
Yeah.
So we have another question from someone who has a friend whose daughter has just been diagnosed with COVID-19. Any suggestions for supporting a family that's dealing with a diagnosis?
The first thing I would say is I'm not a medical professional.
Sure.
So I have nothing to say about that particular aspect of it. I would think about, I know that the family will need to be separate from that daughter. Are they living in the same house? Does it look like that in the question?
It was unclear. Yeah. It says a friend whose daughter has been diagnosed with the virus.
Yeah. So we don't know if they're living together or not. And it may be that they're not. And I think of this as one of the most painful aspects of this disease is that we can't be with our loved ones. And as far as I know, we have to once again think about how do we reach out, and what can I provide for the daughter, for what she needs? How can I ensure she has what she needs, by way of food and other important necessities? But beyond that, I don't know what we can do in those circumstances, because I know, again, from clients of mine who have relatives in the hospital, whether with COVID or not. One is a 97-year-old grandmother, who is enormously vulnerable, not in the hospital with COVID, but nonetheless in a nursing home, and they can't visit her, they can't see her. So I think we have to use technology, we have to use computers, we have to be online. I wish I had a better answer to that. I think it's one of the most painful parts.
Yeah. And there's also the issue of we don't know how many folks are going to die as a result of this crisis. And I was involved with a death this week unrelated to COVID-19, but was just shown how different grieving is going to be during this time, however long this time lasts. Folks don't get to gather around them, their closest family and friends, in the same way, and grieve in the same way, especially now with the order at 8 p.m. tonight of no gatherings of any kind. Even small funerals will not be a possibility. And I'm curious what you think grief might look like over the course of the next few weeks and months, and ways to deal with grief. Hopefully we won't have to deal with it, but to the extent that we will.
Well, we will have to deal with it.
Yeah.
Right? We will. I think this experience is transformative, whether you are in the medical profession or clergy or mental health professionals. We will have to we will have to create new rituals. We will have to create new ways of grieving. We know that in other dramatic experiences in history, when something very powerful happens in a country or in the world, rituals change and behaviors change. So already we don't hug one another, and we don't shake hands, and we don't touch one another. And so the idea that we will be grieving, that we would lose a family member, grieve, and not be touching one another, or perhaps not even be with that family member when he or she dies, is just unthinkable. But I think in terms of clergy and mental health professionals, we have to think together imaginatively and creatively about, well, what do we do? What does church mean? I mean, houses of worship, synagogues, mosques, churches are right now trying to figure out what does it mean? What are we doing? How do we touch people when we're not allowed to touch them? And so I think we're going to be in I can't answer that question. That's what I would say. I can't answer it because I can't imagine it. But we'll have to. You know what I mean? We will have to.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't think fully through it until I saw it this week, that a family didn't get to grieve in the way that otherwise it would have been able to.
Yes.
And I was just foreseeing, depending how long this lasts, whether deaths have to deal with COVID-19 or not, that this is going to be an issue that's going to come up.
Yeah. I come from an Irish Catholic background, and we go to wakes, we go to that wake and we all stand around, and people come from far and wide, and people show up because somebody died.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I remember very well, when, one of my uncles died many years ago. It was like midnight or something. We all just went. You just went there because you have to show up.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where our imaginations will be challenged. And we'll look to artists and musicians and other creative people to teach us the way about, we're going to have to do everything differently. What should it look like?
Yeah, and as you mentioned, churches are reimagining things. This forum session is part of how we're trying to reimagine what church is. And it's been amazing to me over the course of the past week to see how much our virtual presence has mattered to people in this time. That even though we are still finding our way in this virtual new reality, we are able to do it somewhat. And I know you mentioned that you're seeing clients now via Zoom. I wonder what that experience is like, and how are your sessions different, not just because of the medium, but also what are your clients going through differently because of COVID-19?
I can tell you that the past week has been very intense.
Yeah.
So that is the first thing I would say, is that it's been enormously intense. The fact that it's on Zoom, I actually like being in a room with people. Zoom is second best, and aren't we lucky to have it?
Yeah.
It feels like, wow, we can actually, just like you and I are face to face right now, we're talking to each other. So it takes a little getting used to, but then, you forget it and you're in the conversation. So it's very important that we have the platform and that we're able to continue, and we have to stay connected. We have to stay connected.
Sure. I'm wondering, you mentioned one of the effects of stress being not caring at all. And members of my generation have gotten some flack from public figures for not caring enough about the virus and their effect of gathering and congregating. And it makes me wonder, how do you see this virus and the kind of crisis we're going through affecting people of different ages in different ways? I can imagine that the kinds of things a 70-year-old is going through might be somewhat different from the kinds of things a 18-year-old is going through.
Sure.
The impact of this crisis.
Absolutely. I'd like to use myself as an example. It feels to me like it took me a while to get it. This past week was my first week of working at home. But the week before that, I was in the office. And, I was there every day, and all the weeks before that. And I feel like, even for me, who, is not in the age group you're talking about. Even for me, it took me a while to say, oh, this is really serious. No, I really can't do that. So on the one hand, I have some compassion for younger people who, I guess what I would say is they're also having a hard time getting it. They're having a hard time getting it. And when you're younger and really healthy and really strong, without any underlying conditions at all, it's hard to wrap your mind around the fact that your lifestyle has to change. Your lifestyle has to change. So I think that if we can recognize that, yeah, somebody my age is going to get it quicker, get the understanding quicker, probably, because I know that I'm more vulnerable than somebody who's 30. But we need to, I think that in a very short period of time, we're going to find so many people affected and so many families affected that may become less of an issue.
Mm.
Because even if I'm 30 and I'm perfectly healthy and well, my grandmother just died.
Right.
So, I have a lot of faith in us coming together. But I also understand why people who are younger are having a hard time with it, getting it.
Sure. So two more questions before I let you go. I'm wondering about COVID-19 and intimacy. Isolation affects the way we're able to be intimate with others. You can do it virtually. And I've talked to both couples that have said, being, especially in New York, being confined in an enclosed space, both working from home can be a real challenge on their relationship. I've also heard from single people that are used to dating, and
right,
that's not a real option right now. So I'm curious, sort of, your thoughts on navigating intimacy in this time.
Yeah. There's a wonderful document recently put out by the New York City Health Department about sex and COVID-19. And it's very specific and very detailed. And I can get you the link to that. But I can tell you that some of the things it's saying. One is that kissing actually is a way that one communicates, can communicate COVID. And so this talk about a difficulty for people who are really wondering about what does this mean. The New York City Health Department is recommending if you have a partner, that's good. Be with that partner. Beyond that, limit your partners. Because this virus is very widespread, and there's no way to measure, and we're not testing. And so I think it has to do with how many partners someone has, whether they're in a stable, committed relationship, and how that will affect their sexual life and their intimate life. So I can also get that document to you.
Sure. Can you speak at all to the pressures that couples face?
Oh, I think the pressures are intense, because it was what I was saying before about anger and irritability.
Yeah.
Both partners are under a tremendous amount of stress. Maybe they're both working from home. Maybe they're trying to homeschool their children. Maybe they're not feeling well themselves. Even if it's not COVID-19, they might be feeling depressed. So I think that couples are going to need other people to talk to. Because one of the effects of this is that we're trapped in the same house. And so the tendency to blame or to say it's your fault or to be overly irritable or something like that is very high. So probably a couple needs also to be able to be in touch with other friends, talk with other friends, because you can't expect that the partner will be able to manage all of the needs and even all of the emotional experience.
Great. So finally, I'm curious about, a lot of people in the restaurant industry, other industries have been laid off recently. And it's always a huge amount of stress to be out of work, but combine that with the global pandemic, and I can imagine those folks are under a lot of stress. Any thoughts about navigating lack of employment, financial difficulties, et cetera, in this context?
Call your representative. I think that we are right now, even as we speak, politicians are debating how monies are going to be distributed. And there's a very, very big political debate going on right now. And at this moment, there's no, maybe by the time we get off, it will have been settled. But I think that, if we move away from the individual and the personal experiences, thoughts, feelings, emotions, and all of that, we have to widen the lens to the political reality that we live in and recognize that the help that those people are going to need will need to come from the government, and that we will need to, as a country, decide where our values lie. And there's a lot of discussion right now about, how the 2008 bailout happened, what the solutions were, and what the long-term effects were. Well, now we're in another moment. And it's very, very important what politicians decide so that that restaurant worker actually gets help. That's what I'd say.
Yeah. Well, we are coming close to the end of our time. Do you have anything further you think we need to talk about before we end?
Peter, I guess what I would want to say is I think that we are making it up as we go along.
That's certainly what we're doing.
That's what I feel. Like even answering questions, feels a bit grandiose. We're making it up. We're trying to figure it out. Let's be kind to each other. Let's be compassionate. Let's really seek out the advice of experts, people who know, people whose profession it is to know about medical issues, etc. And let's be a community. Agreed.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Mary Reagan, the Executive Director of the Psychotherapy and Spirituality Institute. It has been a delight to talk with you. I thank you so much for your willingness to do this on such short notice, your willingness to stick with us through some technical difficulties. We really appreciate your generosity and time and spirit this afternoon.
Happy to do it, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you so much.